It began on a night when the mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath. In the remote hollows of Appalachia, where the wind carries voices from long-forgotten cabins, and the roads twist like the lines on a weathered map, 14 men entered a world they could never leave. These men had taken something that belonged to the Turner clan, a moonshine still, simple enough to most. But in these mountains, it was more than metal and fire. It was pride, legacy, and a challenge that could not be ignored. By the time the moon had risen high over the peaks, the forest swallowed every trace of their passage. Footprints disappeared into the undergrowth. Fires flickered and died without leaving a trail. And in the distance, the mountains seemed to listen. Something was moving through the trees, slow, deliberate, relentless. Families in nearby hollows would wake to an emptiness they could not name. Dogs barked until dawn, and then fell silent. Lights flickered in cabins that had not known electricity, and neighbors would tell stories of shadows gliding between trees where no one could stand. Whispers of a hunt began circulating. Tales carried on the wind of a group who had taken what was forbidden, and a family who would not let it go. This was not a single act of revenge. It was a pursuit measured over hours, over miles, over terrain few outsiders could survive. The Turner clan knew these mountains in a way outsiders could never imagine. The hidden paths, the caves where water ran beneath rock, the ridges where a cry could echo without answer. And so, one by one, those 14 men found themselves disappearing. Some said they heard screams that stopped abruptly. Others spoke of fires burning in the hollows, then vanishing by sunrise. Even the moon seemed to shift when these men entered the mountains, casting shadows that could stretch for miles, making each step uncertain. The locals who remained remember the silence that followed, dense, complete, unbroken, until the forest claimed it as its own. When morning arrived, the mountains appeared unchanged. Mist rolled along the ridges, birds sang as if the night had been nothing. And yet, nothing could erase the fear that had settled in every cabin along the hollow, a quiet knowledge that the Turner clan had moved, and that anyone who dared cross them risked vanishing into the same wilderness. These events would not be recorded in newspapers, and no court records would ever tell the full story. What survived were fragments, rumors, recollections, hushed warnings passed from one generation to the next. Names whispered, faces described vaguely, but details always incomplete. And the forest held its secrets tightly, like a witness refusing to testify. Tonight, we will follow the trail of those 14 men, tracing the steps of a family whose reputation for retaliation had been built over decades. We will reconstruct the night the mountains took them, examining the decisions, the mistakes, and the relentless pursuit that would leave no one untouched. Before we go deeper into the shadows of Appalachia, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We want to know how far the mountain's whispers have traveled tonight. This is the story of the Turner clan, and of a night in 1987 when the Appalachian woods became a maze of fear, loss, and vanished lives. Over the next 2 hours, we will explore the mountains, the family, and the men who would challenge them. Every ridge, every hollow, every shadow carries a memory of that night, a memory that refuses to fade. The Appalachians are more than mountains. They are a network of ridges, hollows, and hidden valleys that have shaped the lives of everyone who has lived within them. In 1987, these mountains were still wild, isolated in a way that made outsiders uncomfortable. Dirt roads wound between steep slopes and thick forests, and communities survived on what they could grow, hunt, or distill. Among these hills, moonshine was not simply a drink. It was a lifeline. Families built their livelihoods around the stills hidden in barns, caves, and remote clearings. The Turner clan had been making moonshine in Harlan County for generations. Every barrel carried more than liquor. It carried the weight of their name, their pride, and the implicit understanding that any insult or theft would be met with swift and absolute response. Life in these hollows was harsh. Winters froze rivers and closed the roads. Summers brought thunderstorms that turned the trails into mud pits and rivers into torrents. But it was the isolation that shaped the people the most. Everyone knew their neighbors, and everyone knew the consequences of crossing the wrong family. Stories of feuds stretched back decades, whispered in the porches of cabins and in the quiet of empty churches. These were not stories meant to entertain. They were warnings. The Turners were known throughout the county. Harlan Turner, the patriarch, had a reputation for meticulous planning and relentless follow-through. He expected loyalty from his family, obedience from his kin, and respect from anyone who came near their territory. Rumors spoke of past incidents, disputes over property, over hunting rights, over stolen whiskey, that had ended in sudden disappearances or blood left in the woods. People in neighboring hollows learned quickly that the Turners did not negotiate. They acted, and they remembered. On that fateful summer night, the Turner clan was quiet. There was no alarm, no shouting. Yet in the hollows and trails, the air carried an awareness of what was to come. 14 men had trespassed against the family, taking a prize that was as much symbolic as it was valuable. And for Harlan Turner and his kin, there could be only one response: retrieval. But this was not a simple matter of revenge. The mountains themselves were part of the equation. Dense forests hid paths known only to locals. Caves and hollows offered places to disappear or to ambush. Streams ran beneath rocky overhangs, echoing with the sound of steps and cries, yet revealing nothing to the untrained eye. Every shadow could be a hiding place, every sound a warning. And the Turners knew these lands in ways that the outsiders could never hope to match. To understand what happened that night, it is necessary to understand the world these men entered. The mountains did not just shape the landscape, they shaped the people who lived there. Children grew up learning which paths were safe, which families could be crossed, and which were untouchable. They grew up listening to stories of feuds and disappearances. They grew up knowing that the woods could swallow a man whole if he was careless, if he was unlucky, if he challenged the wrong family. The stolen still was the spark, but the tinder had been years in the making. The Turners had long memories, and the mountains had long shadows. On the night of the theft, everything aligned. The wrong people in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the first hours passed, the forest itself seemed to watch. It was alive with the sounds of pursuit, the rustle of leaves under boots, the snap of twigs, whispers of wind moving through branches. Yet nothing could warn the 14 men of the scale of what they had unleashed. This is where we begin our journey. Over the next several hours, the men would move through the woods, trying to evade a family whose skills were honed over decades. Every decision, every hesitation, every step taken on the wrong path could mean the difference between life and disappearance. And all the while, the Turner clan moved with patience, tracking each motion, leaving trails only they could read. As we follow their paths, it becomes clear that this is not a story of luck, chance, or coincidence. This is a story of knowledge, of environment, and of the unyielding will of a family that had learned the art of survival, the rules of the mountains, and the power of fear. To watch, to listen, is to step into a world where every sound can be a signal, every shadow can hide intent, and every hollow can hold a secret. Over the next minutes, we will explore each hollow, each ridge, and each cabin. We will retrace the paths of those 14 men, examining what led them here, how they moved, and what they encountered as the Turner clan began their pursuit. In these woods, no movement goes unnoticed, no sound goes unheard. And as we follow, the story unfolds like the twisting roads themselves, complex, dark, and inescapable. The night began quietly, with the kind of stillness that can make a man feel exposed even within his own home. The forest lay heavy around the Turners' homestead. The hills were dark, punctuated only by the occasional glint of moonlight on leaves wet with dew. Somewhere along the edge of the clearing, 14 men were moving. Their goal seemed simple enough: take what they wanted and leave before anyone noticed. They did not know that they had stepped into a world governed by rules far older than the law. They did not know the names of those who watched, who remembered, who waited. They did not know that the Turners had eyes that could see what others could not, ears that could detect a single footstep across broken twigs, instincts sharpened by decades of guarding their family and their territory. The still itself was hidden beneath tarps and straw, carefully concealed in a shed that had stood for years without anyone seeing inside. It was more than metal. It was a symbol of survival, a measure of pride, and the means by which the family had sustained themselves through countless hardships. Its theft was more than a loss. It was a challenge. And challenges were not tolerated by the Turners. The 14 men moved quickly. They worked with the efficiency of people who believed themselves clever, who believed that nothing could go wrong in the cover of darkness. But the forest does not forget the sound of disturbance. The snap of a branch underfoot, the rustle of a tarp, the metallic scrape of a barrel being lifted, all of it echoed, carried by the wind to ears trained to listen. Inside the Turner homestead, a door shifted. The sound was almost imperceptible, yet it was enough. Harlan Turner had been awake for hours. He had sensed movement, a slight disturbance in the rhythm of the night. He walked through the shadows of his cabin without a sound, reaching the window that looked toward the shed. There, faint figures were moving, lit intermittently by the silver light of the moon. He did not speak. He did not shout. He only observed. And then the family moved, quietly, methodically, like shadows themselves slipping between the trees. The men outside were oblivious to what was unfolding. Each step they took, each barrel lifted, brought them closer to a world they could not escape. They were walking into the web of a family whose knowledge of the land was absolute. Paths were memorized, corners anticipated, every possible route of escape considered. By the time the still was lifted and the 14 men turned toward the road, they had already been marked. The Turners were in position, invisible but present, watching as the forest around them shifted and breathed. Every rustle, every whisper of wind became part of the tracking, as though the mountains themselves had aligned with the family's pursuit. And then the first sounds came, snaps of twigs, the soft crush of leaves beneath boots that moved with deliberate care. The men thought it might be an animal. They thought it might be nothing. But they were wrong. The forest was no longer a place of cover. It had become a space of exposure. And the Turners had already begun their methodical approach. Panic had not yet set in. The men still carried the belief that they could outrun anyone, that a stolen still was a prize to be delivered to their own advantage. They had no way of knowing that the mountains themselves could betray them, that the Turners had already calculated their every likely move. And as the night deepened, the wind carrying distant sounds that seemed like voices but were only echoes, the distance between predator and prey was shrinking, almost imperceptibly, but inexorably. By the time the first of the 14 men reached the old fork in the path, the one that led either into the hollow or back toward the main road, the Turners were already waiting. Hidden behind trees, in hollows, in depressions carved into the landscape, the family observed. They did not rush. They did not give away their presence. They understood that the forest itself was their greatest ally, and that patience was more lethal than speed. Somewhere further down the trail, another pair of men heard something in the distance, soft but deliberate. They froze, listening. The night seemed suddenly too quiet, the normal rhythm of the forest replaced by a tension they could not place. And in that pause the Turners had moved closer, their shadows merging with the darkness, leaving the men with no idea how close the family had become. The first confrontation was about to occur. And yet, it was not yet a confrontation in the way anyone could have imagined. There were no shouts, no lights, no dramatic struggle. Only the slow tightening of a noose crafted over decades, using knowledge, patience, and an intimate understanding of the terrain. The mountains themselves held their breath, as if waiting to see which side would yield first. This is the moment when the story truly begins. The moment the 14 men realized, too late, that they had entered a space they could not leave unscathed. And as the minutes passed, and the forest closed in around them, one question remained. Who would move first? And who would vanish into the shadows that had been waiting all along? Once the Turners had marked their targets, the forest seemed to shift around them. The men who had taken the still moved with urgency now, unaware that each step was being observed, each choice anticipated. The forest itself offered no refuge, no place truly hidden. Every hollow, every ridge, every curve in the trail became part of a grid known only to those who had lived among these mountains all their lives. The first hours of pursuit were quiet, almost imperceptible. The men moving with the stolen still did not hear the soft disturbances. Leaves rustling under careful weight, a small branch moved aside, a snapped twig that could have been anyone or no one at all. The Turners did not rush. They had no need to. They understood the power of patience, of letting fear grow gradually, of allowing the hunted to reveal themselves through movement and sound. As the night deepened, unease began to take hold. One of the 14 men, carrying the heaviest barrel, stumbled across a fallen log. He cursed under his breath, and the sound traveled farther than he could know. A shadow shifted in the distance, but when he turned, nothing was there. Only the thick darkness of the forest, the mist curling around the trunks like smoke, and the sense that they were being watched. It was the first moment that terror began to creep into their minds. Not a terror born of sight, but of uncertainty. The kind of fear that makes a man question every movement, every sound, every instinct. They could hear the river nearby, the low rumble of water over rocks, and yet even that familiar sound seemed to amplify the distance, the isolation, the impossibility of escape. By the time the Turners made their first visible approach, the 14 men were scattered. Some had taken a side trail, hoping to reach a road that would carry them away from the mountains. Others pressed on toward a ridge, thinking higher ground would offer safety. But the forest does not favor those who believe themselves clever. Every path had been walked, every hiding place observed, and every pattern anticipated. The first encounter occurred near a hollow, where the ground dropped sharply, hidden beneath shadows. A pair of men paused, hearing the soft, deliberate steps of someone moving nearby. One reached for a weapon, thinking it would offer protection. But before action could be taken, a figure emerged from the darkness. A turner, quiet and controlled, standing in a position that seemed to appear from nowhere. There was no shouting, no struggle. The forest itself seemed to hold the moment in place, suspended, waiting. Panic began to spread among the group. They realized they had underestimated the knowledge, the patience, and the resolve of the Turner clan. The men who had felt confident in their plan now moved with caution, glancing over shoulders, hesitating at every creek and every tree line. The forest became a labyrinth. Even the sounds they thought were familiar, wind through leaves, water in streams, distant animals, seemed amplified, each one a potential threat, each one a signal of presence. As they moved further, small mistakes compounded. One man stepped on a branch that gave way with a sharp crack. Another made a misstep into a shallow stream, drawing attention through the sound of rushing water. The Turners observed from positions hidden in hollows and behind ridges, using every advantage offered by the mountains. Each moment increased the tension. Each movement became a test of instinct and fear. The first night stretched on without resolution, but the psychological impact had already taken hold. Exhaustion, hunger, and the realization that they were being hunted began to erode the confidence of the 14 men. The forest, which had once seemed a neutral landscape, had become a space of uncertainty. Every shadow, every sound, every turn in the trail carried the potential for encounter, and the sense of being pursued was relentless. By dawn, the group had split further. Smaller clusters moved independently, hoping to confuse the Turners, hoping that distance and separation would create safety. But in the mountains, separation is often a trap. The Turners could move swiftly along known paths, anticipating where their targets might emerge. By mid-morning, the first men had vanished from sight, their positions known only to the hunters. Even in the light of day, the tension persisted. Birds called out over the treetops, seemingly unaware of the hunt below, yet their movements and sounds were absorbed into the forest's rhythm, adding to the uncertainty. The 14 men were no longer simply fleeing. They were navigating a terrain that had been mapped against them, each decision a possible misstep. And so, the hunt continued. Hours turned into the afternoon. The forest shifted around them, offering cover in one moment and exposure in the next. The Turners moved silently, deliberately, taking advantage of every feature of the land. The ridges, the hollows, the streams, the dense undergrowth. The men who had taken the still began to understand that escape would not come from speed or chance. It would only come from understanding a forest they had never truly known. As the first day faded toward evening, the hunters and the hunted had already changed. Fear had settled in the minds of those fleeing. Confidence had hardened the focus of those pursuing. And the mountains, timeless and indifferent, held every secret, every movement, every moment, for those who knew how to read them. That night, the 14 men would discover that in the forest of the Turner clan, every sound carried meaning, every shadow suggested presence, and every step was a choice that could not be undone. As the afternoon faded into the long shadows of evening, the forest seemed to close in around the 14 men. The heat of the day gave way to the cool hush of dusk, and with the change of light came a shift in perception. Every ridge seemed steeper, every hollow deeper, every path uncertain. The men began to sense that the mountains themselves had become obstacles, that the terrain had aligned with those who knew it best. The first mistake had already been made. The group had split, believing that smaller numbers could move faster, escape more easily. But the mountains were a network of observation, knowledge, and anticipation. Paths that appeared simple from above were treacherous, concealed by undergrowth, shadows, and the natural curves of the land. The Turners, moving with quiet precision, had already predicted the splitting of their prey. It was a strategy they had encountered before, and they knew how to respond. As night approached, the forest became a maze. Small streams reflected the moonlight intermittently, guiding and deceiving simultaneously. One man paused at the edge of a creek, his reflection fractured in the water, the sound of his breathing amplified by the quiet. Behind him, a faint movement, barely perceptible, suggested he was not alone. He spun, but saw nothing. Only the dense, unmoving darkness. Only the forest. Only the impression that he was being watched. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the mountains, another pair of men reached a hollow where fallen trees had formed a natural barrier. They paused, thinking they might rest for a moment. The air was still, heavy with the smell of wet earth and the faint aroma of burned wood from distant fires. And yet, even in that pause, the forest was alive with presence. The Turners moved along ridges above, along hidden trails, anticipating the men's hesitation. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, carried weight, signaling proximity, position, and intent. Exhaustion was beginning to set in. Hunger and fatigue made every decision slower, every movement more noticeable. The 14 men were discovering the cost of isolation, the challenge of navigating a wilderness that they had assumed would conceal them. Every direction seemed uncertain. Every sound seemed amplified, and every shadow suggested something, though nothing ever fully revealed itself. As darkness fell, the forest became an even more complex environment. Mist began to rise from the lower hollows, curling around roots and rocks. Visibility dropped. The men relied on memory, instinct, and the dim light of the moon. But instinct can mislead, memory can fail, and the moonlight can create illusions. The Turners understood this. They allowed the forest to play its role, knowing that fear would accelerate mistakes, revealing paths, exposing movements, and eventually guiding the hunted toward positions predetermined by those who knew the land best. The first close encounter of the night came when one man, separated from his group, attempted to climb a ridge to gain a view of the surrounding terrain. He thought he could anticipate the Turners' movements, imagining that height offered safety. But the forest offered no such advantage. From concealed hollows above and below, silent watchers observed every motion. The man sensed something, a pressure in the air, a feeling that he was no longer alone. When he called out to his companions, no answer returned. The mountains had swallowed their voices. Elsewhere, a different group of men moved along a side trail, hoping to reach a small clearing where they believed they could rest. The path was narrow, flanked by steep drops on one side and dense underbrush on the other. One misstep, a foot sliding into loose soil, would have consequences that could not be undone. Every sound seemed to echo unnaturally, carried by the contours of the land. And in that moment, the Turners were closer than anyone could sense, observing, calculating, waiting. Fear, once subtle, was now a constant companion. The forest, which had seemed neutral, had transformed into a landscape of tension. Every movement was amplified, every misstep magnified. Sleep became impossible, rest impossible. Each man had become attuned to the smallest sounds: a distant bird, the flow of a stream, the whisper of wind through leaves. But these sounds, ordinary in another context, now signaled proximity, presence, and danger. By the late night hours, the pursuit had reached a rhythm. The Turners moved along hidden paths, silently cutting off potential escape routes. The hunted tried to coordinate through whispers, but separation made communication nearly impossible. The men began to understand that this was no ordinary chase. They were navigating a forest whose rules were written by the Turners, a family who had mastered the land, its secrets, and the psychology of fear. And yet, the mountains did not yield entirely to either side. Obstacles appeared unexpectedly: fallen trees, hidden streams, rocky outcrops. The hunted adapted, improvising movement, adjusting their paths, constantly calculating risk. The Turners adapted in response, maintaining distance, observing patterns, and allowing tension to build. Every encounter, every near sighting, increased the psychological weight, turning the forest into a pressure chamber where error became inevitable. The first day of pursuit had ended, but the night was far from over. The 14 men were scattered across the mountains, each aware of the others, each aware of the unseen presence tracking them. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear had become inseparable companions. And as the first hints of dawn began to appear on the ridges, the forest seemed unchanged. Yet every step forward carried the memory of shadows, the awareness of watchers, and the certainty that the hunt would continue without pause. As the night deepened, the mountains seemed to tighten around the 14 men. What had begun as a chase now became a test of endurance, patience, and instinct. Each of the men knew, in some part of themselves, that the forest was no longer neutral. Every hollow, every ridge, every stream had been observed and catalogued long before they had entered. The first confrontation occurred in a narrow hollow, where 2 of the men had sought refuge behind fallen trees and thick underbrush. The sound of careful movement reached them, soft at first, then deliberate. It was not loud, but it carried weight, significance, an understanding that someone else was close, observing, waiting. They whispered to each other, trying to coordinate escape, but hesitation only increased the pressure. The mountains had learned their presence, and patience would prove more effective than panic. Suddenly, the shadows shifted. Figures emerged, moving silently among the trees, following paths that only the Turners could know. The men froze, realizing too late that they were cornered. There was no struggle, no shouting, just the measured approach of those who understood the terrain perfectly. In that instant, the forest became a chamber, compressing their options, eliminating any escape. One man attempted to retreat, hoping the uneven ground and thick foliage could conceal him. But instinct betrayed him. The subtle shifts of underbrush, the gentle sound of snapping twigs, gave away his position. The others in his group could do nothing but watch as he disappeared from view. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound could be. It was a silence filled with awareness, an understanding that mistakes carried consequences far greater than anyone had imagined. Elsewhere, another pair of men, having moved along a ridge in an attempt to regroup with the rest, encountered the Turners in a narrow corridor between rock outcrops. Movement was careful, deliberate, measured. The hunted froze, uncertain whether to run or remain still. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and in that space between decision and action, the Turners closed the distance, their knowledge of terrain allowing them to appear in positions that the men had assumed were unreachable. This was the beginning of the realization that survival would require more than courage. It required understanding the land as the Turners did, anticipating their moves, and overcoming fatigue and fear. Every decision carried weight. Every hesitation magnified risk. The first losses, those who had vanished or been forced into inescapable positions, set a tone that would reverberate through the night and the following days. The remaining men, now fully aware of the Turners' approach, began to adapt. Small groups moved silently along side paths, attempting to mislead the hunters, but the mountains themselves resisted deception. Streams, hollows, and ridges provided no guarantee. Sound carried farther than expected. Shadows revealed movement that was assumed hidden. And the Turners, moving with absolute familiarity, anticipated patterns before they could even form. Panic had begun to take hold. It was not the panic of sudden danger, but the creeping awareness that each step could be observed, each path anticipated, and each moment misjudged. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear intertwined. The men began to speak less, whispering only when absolutely necessary, communicating in gestures rather than words. Even the faintest sound, a shift in a backpack, a soft exhalation, was enough to draw attention. Night fell deeper still, and the forest transformed into a landscape of uncertainty. Mist rolled over the hollows, obscuring sightlines, making every decision harder. The Turners moved along ridges and depressions, following the sound, the disturbance, the pattern of movement. Each man who vanished reinforced the psychological weight on those remaining. They had begun to understand the true extent of the forest's observation, the Turners' methodical approach, and the limits of their own knowledge. By midnight, the 14 had become fragments, groups of 1, 2, and 3, scattered across miles of forest. Each small group experienced the mountains differently. One man found himself climbing a rocky incline, searching for a vantage point, and discovered only the echo of movement elsewhere. Another group pressed through thick undergrowth, realizing too late that the ground had been prepared to reveal their passage. And yet, another cluster moved quietly along a stream, hearing sounds that seemed to follow them, yet revealing nothing. Each encounter, each near miss, heightened the tension. Exhaustion blurred judgment. Hunger sharpened desperation. Fear became a tool wielded by the Turners as they guided the movements of those fleeing. Every step forward carried risk. Every choice made could determine whether the forest would conceal them or deliver them into waiting hands. As dawn approached, the first survivors of the night emerged into small clearings, catching glimpses of the mountains around them. But even in those moments of partial safety, the awareness of pursuit lingered. The mountains held memories of movement, traces of passage, and the knowledge of those who had mastered their terrain. The 14 men had entered a realm in which they were outsiders, and every hour brought the forest, and the Turners, closer to defining the outcome of the night. As the second night settled over the mountains, the forest transformed once again. Darkness stretched deeper into every hollow, every ridge, and every crevice, while the mist rolled low, clinging to the ground and obscuring paths. For the 14 men, already fragmented and exhausted, the forest had become a labyrinth in which each turn carried a question. Would the path ahead offer freedom or another trap? The Turners had divided their efforts, sending smaller groups along separate trails to anticipate the movements of the fleeing men. Knowledge of the land gave them an advantage that was impossible to counter. Hidden hollows, overlooked ridges, and narrow passes were all known and understood. Each man who had taken the still was being funneled subtly, guided by the silent manipulation of terrain and by a family who had spent decades mastering it. One man climbed a ridge, thinking to gain sight of a possible escape. Below, the valley stretched into the darkness, the stream winding like a ribbon through the trees. He paused, listening. A faint rustle suggested movement behind him. He spun, and for a heartbeat, glimpsed a shadow retreating into the darkness. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. The sense of being watched tightened like a cord around his chest. Every instinct told him to flee. Every thought screamed caution. Elsewhere, two men had moved into a hollow, thinking the depression of the land would conceal them. They crouched behind fallen trees and underbrush, whispering, trying to calm themselves. The sound of distant water, flowing over rocks, seemed louder in the quiet. And then they noticed something. Subtle depressions in the soil, small impressions of footprints, the faint disturbance of leaves and twigs. Someone had passed this way recently, and not as a passerby. The movement had a purpose. Every detail of the forest told a story, and they could read only fragments. The Turners advanced carefully, never rushing, never exposing themselves. Their approach was methodical. They understood that fear was as effective a tool as the physical presence of their family. The hunted could make mistakes, reveal positions, exhaust themselves, all without a single sound of confrontation. Patience was the weapon. And the mountains, with all their ridges, hollows, and creeks, were allies in that pursuit. Mist thickened as the night wore on. The men moved cautiously, hesitant with every step, and the forest seemed alive with sound. The creak of a branch under a careful foot, the sudden rustle of leaves from an unseen source, the distant call of a bird breaking the silence. Every noise was interpreted as threat, every shadow assumed to conceal intent. Psychological pressure compounded the physical challenge. Sleep was impossible. Rest became a hazard. The first signs of misdirection began to take effect. Some men attempted to circle back toward old paths, hoping the familiarity of certain landmarks would provide safety. But the Turners anticipated such actions, positioning themselves along these likely routes. Each misstep, each hesitation, drew the hunted closer to confrontation. The forest no longer offered neutrality. Each hollow, each ridge, each creek became a line on a map the Turners had drawn for the night. In one encounter, a man moving alone reached a small ridge, thinking he had outpaced the pursuit. From behind a natural barrier, a Turner appeared. Not with noise, not with overt threat, but with presence, calculated, silent, immovable. The man froze, understanding the truth in an instant. Movement here meant exposure. Retreat was uncertain, advance even riskier. The forest seemed to close around him, guiding him, constraining him, holding him in place until the next step would be decided for him. Small groups of men tried to regroup, whispering, signaling each other, moving through streams and low hollows. Yet every attempt carried risk. Footsteps left impressions, branches snapped, mist shifted. The Turners observed, adjusting, guiding, and allowing the hunted to make mistakes that would compound over hours. It was a strategic symphony, orchestrated in silence. Throughout the night, the pressure never eased. Hunger and fatigue became sharper instruments in the Turners' hands. The men who had once thought themselves clever began to understand that survival would require an understanding of the mountains beyond instinct. The terrain itself had become a participant. Every ridge, every stream, every slope communicated information, revealing the positions, movements, and decisions of those who thought themselves hidden. The forest seemed indifferent, yet responsive. A fallen tree, a rocky incline, a hidden stream, all ordinary, all natural, and yet all part of the carefully guided flow of the night. The Turners did not chase recklessly. They allowed the environment to lead the men forward, toward positions predetermined by knowledge, patience, and skill. By the early hours of the second night, the 14 had become fragmented into the smallest possible groups. The psychological strain was mounting. Fear and uncertainty eroded coordination. Exhaustion clouded judgment. The Turners maintained distance, observing patterns, anticipating reactions, and preparing for the moments when the forest itself would leave the men with no choice but exposure. The first night's losses had been measured. The second night's strategy focused on anticipation, manipulation, and the steady tightening of the pursuit. Each step taken by the hunted carried weight. Each sound was a clue. Each pause, a potential mistake. And as the hours passed, the mountains watched, remembered, and waited, leaving only one certainty. The pursuit was far from over, and the forest would not release its secrets until the outcome was complete. As the second night reached its deepest hour, the forest had transformed completely. Mist lay thick over every hollow, every ridge, and the trees cast shifting shadows that made paths indistinguishable. The 14 men, already fragmented and exhausted, had little sense of direction, little sense of time, and increasingly little hope. Every decision they made carried weight. Every sound, every shadow, every moment of hesitation could seal their fate. The Turners, moving with absolute precision, had orchestrated their positions to guide the remaining men toward natural bottlenecks. Narrow ridges, steep hollows, and shallow streams became traps, not in the violent sense, but in the strategic sense. Movement was controlled, options were limited, and the forest itself seemed to reinforce the Turners' plan. One man, trying to navigate a creek that cut through a hollow, realized too late that he had been funneled into a position where retreat was impossible. He froze, listening to the faint sounds of movement from behind, the careful steps of those who had anticipated his route. The forest offered no easy escape. Every potential path had been considered by those who knew the land best. Meanwhile, another small group, climbing a ridge to gain vantage, discovered only more uncertainty. The forest was layered with movement, indistinct shapes, and the constant pressure of observation. They understood, in a way that went beyond fear, that their options had been reduced to near nothing. Every instinct they relied upon was challenged. Every shadow was a possibility. Every decision mattered. By the pre-dawn hours, the men had reached the limits of their endurance. Hunger, exhaustion, and psychological strain combined with the relentless tracking to erode coordination, clarity, and morale. Some stopped moving, attempting to rest, only to realize that remaining still could be as dangerous as moving. Others pushed forward, guided by desperation, aware that each step could bring them closer to confrontation or disappearance. The Turners, in contrast, moved with deliberate patience. They allowed the forest to do much of the work, guiding, exposing, and confining. When necessary, they adjusted, shifted positions, and maintained observation. They did not need to chase in the conventional sense. The forest and its knowledge were already their allies. Each movement of the hunted was anticipated, each reaction predicted. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the final encounters unfolded. Individuals and small groups were isolated by terrain, forced into choices where the forest offered no neutrality. Mist curled around rocks, hollows became barriers, and ridges funneled movement. The Turners had created a pattern in which escape was difficult, and missteps could no longer be corrected. Even in these moments, the forest did not act as an antagonist. It was indifferent, yet it carried the memory of every movement, every footprint, every snap of a branch. The mountains themselves were witnesses, recording everything that had occurred over hours of pursuit. And the men who had entered this landscape with stolen treasure realized fully that their understanding of it had been superficial, incomplete, and fatally limited. As daylight strengthened, the remnants of the 14 were few. Those who remained moved cautiously, aware of how little ground they controlled. The Turners maintained distance, observation, and readiness, allowing the forest to guide the outcome, while ensuring that no opportunity for error passed unnoticed. There was no chaos, no shouting, only precision, awareness, and the slow, inevitable narrowing of options. By mid-morning, the pursuit had ended. The Turners returned to their homestead, leaving the forest as it had been, yet altered by the passage of fear, movement, and decisions. The men who had attempted to escape either vanished into the memory of the mountains or survived in fragmented, exhausted states, carrying with them the awareness of what it meant to be hunted in a landscape mastered by another. Communities in the surrounding hollows would later speak in whispers of the events. Some remembered shadows, strange sounds, and the absence of those who had entered the woods. Others remembered the Turners' quiet presence, the sense of inevitability, and the knowledge that crossing this family came with consequences that were meticulously applied. Over time, the story became legend. Names were remembered cautiously, details passed in fragments, and the mountains themselves became a character in the narrative, unchanging, watchful, and holding the memory of what had transpired. For the Turner clan, the events were a reaffirmation of knowledge, patience, and mastery of the land. For the men who had trespassed, the mountains left a mark far beyond physical harm, a mark of fear, awareness, and the lesson that some landscapes, and some families, demand respect that cannot be ignored. And so, the Appalachian mountains of 1987 held their silence once more. Mist curled through the hollows, streams whispered over stones, and the forest carried its memories quietly. Those who dared to challenge the Turner clan understood, in ways they could never fully explain, that the land itself could enforce consequences, that knowledge and patience were as potent as any weapon, and that some nights, some hunts, and some families are remembered forever, not for spectacle, but for the enduring weight of their reality. If you thought you could escape the forest, think again. But you don't have to walk these mountains alone. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and follow every shadow, every whisper, and every untold story we uncover. Only here will you witness the secrets the mountains keep, and the hunts they never forget.